Like, subscribe, and stay with us, because today's story isn't just about music. It's about identity, loss, resilience, and the quiet cost of fame. This is the human story behind Brian Connolly, the voice that once defined glam rock, rewritten with warmth, depth, and truth. There comes a moment in every artist's life when the truth becomes heavier than the myth built around them, when the glitter fades and what remains is the human being beneath the spotlight. For Brian Connolly, that moment arrived long after the screaming fans, television lights, and chart success had disappeared. In the final years of his life, when fame no longer protected him and silence filled the spaces where applause once lived, Brian began to speak openly about what really happened behind the rise and fall of Sweet. His reflections were not angry or accusatory. They were quiet, fragile, and deeply honest. He spoke like a man finally setting down a burden he had carried alone for decades. The story he told was not just about music or success, but about abandonment, identity, pressure, and survival. To the outside world, Brian Connolly was a glamorous frontman with a powerful voice and fearless stage presence. But behind that image lived a boy who never stopped wondering where he truly belonged. Understanding Brian's life means understanding that his greatest struggles began long before fame ever found him, and that the wounds of childhood followed him into every triumph and every tragedy that came after. Brian Francis Connolly was born on October 5, 1945, in Hamilton, South Lanarkshire, Scotland, into a Britain still recovering from the devastation of World War II. The country was rebuilding itself, but Brian's own beginning was far more fragile. Shortly after his birth, he was left in a Glasgow hospital by his teenage mother, Frances Connolly. The reasons were never fully clear. Some believed she was simply overwhelmed and unable to cope. Others whispered that illness, possibly meningitis, had left her incapable of caring for a child. Whatever the truth, Brian's life began with absence, and that absence became a quiet but powerful force shaping his identity. Even though he was too young to remember being abandoned, the emotional imprint of that beginning followed him. Psychologists often say that early separation leaves marks that surface later in life, and in Brian's case, that sense of being unwanted or replaceable lingered beneath his charm and humor. He would grow up surrounded by love, yet always carry a question he could never fully answer. Why was I left behind? That question became the invisible backdrop to his ambition, his sensitivity, and his need for validation. At the age of 2, Brian was fostered by Jim and Helen McManus, a warm, working-class couple living in Blantyre, Scotland. They raised him as their own, alongside their biological daughter, offering him stability, affection, and a sense of normal family life. For many years, Brian believed he was simply another child in a modest Scottish household. He attended local schools, played in the streets, and grew up surrounded by familiar faces and routines. To outsiders, his childhood looked ordinary, even happy. But inside, there was a subtle sense of difference he couldn't explain. Even before learning the truth of his adoption, Brian felt slightly out of place, as though he was performing a role rather than fully inhabiting it. To cope, he developed humor, charm, and a confident exterior. These traits would later make him magnetic on stage, but they also served as armor. Beneath the jokes and bravado lived insecurity, a fear of rejection, and a deep desire to be loved unconditionally. These early emotional patterns didn't disappear with success. Instead, they evolved, shaping how Brian handled pressure, relationships, and ultimately fame itself. When Brian was 12, the McManus family moved to Hounslow, Middlesex, forcing him to adapt to a new environment and leave behind the familiarity of his Scottish upbringing. Like many adolescents, he struggled with restlessness and a hunger for independence. In his mid-teens, he joined the Merchant Navy, a decision that reflected both his adventurous spirit and his need to escape. The experience toughened him physically and emotionally. He traveled, encountered hardship, and returned with stories that made him seem older than his years. One of the most lasting symbols of this period was the tiger's head tattoo he had inked onto his right arm, a mark of rebellion, resilience, and reinvention. Yet even as he grew stronger on the outside, the unanswered questions about his origins continued to haunt him. The sea gave him distance, but not closure. Those lingering doubts fueled a powerful tension within him. The drive to prove his worth and the fear that he might never truly belong anywhere. That tension would later become both the engine of his success and the source of his deepest pain. At 18, Brian's world shifted dramatically when he learned the truth about his adoption. The revelation shattered the identity he believed in and reopened emotional wounds he didn't know how to process. Suddenly, the quiet sense of difference he had always felt had a name and a reason. In response, Brian reclaimed the surname Connolly, clinging to the only tangible link to his biological past. Around this time, rumors circulated that he might be related to actor Mark McManus, later famous for the television series Taggart, due to their striking resemblance. The speculation fascinated and unsettled him in equal measure. It represented everything he struggled with, the desire to know where he came from and the fear that he might never fully fit anywhere. Amid this emotional turbulence, Brian discovered something that truly belonged to him, his voice. In pubs and local clubs, people stopped to listen. His singing had clarity, strength, and emotional pull. Music gave him control, identity, and purpose. For the first time, he felt complete. That voice became his escape, his confidence, and the foundation upon which he would build his future. In 1967, Brian Connolly and drummer Mick Tucker left Wainwright's Gentlemen, unaware that this decision would change their lives forever. They were young, ambitious, and chasing something bigger than themselves. Along with bassist Steve Priest and guitarist Frank Torpey, they formed a new band called The Sweet Shop. The early years were far from glamorous. They played small venues, endured long rehearsals, and survived on minimal pay. But there was undeniable chemistry, especially between Brian and Mick. Brian's voice immediately stood out, distinctive, expressive, and powerful. When the band shortened their name to Sweet in 1968, they hoped for better fortune. Instead, early singles failed and frustration mounted. In 1970, Frank Torpey departed and Andy Scott joined, completing the classic lineup. This change marked a turning point, with Andy's arrival. The band's sound tightened, and their potential became clearer. Industry attention followed, and for the first time, success felt within reach. Brian stood at the center, his voice carrying not just songs, but the collective dream of four young men desperate to be heard. Sweet's real breakthrough came when they connected with producers Phil Wainman and the songwriting duo Nicky Chinn and Mike Chapman. Known for crafting irresistible pop hits, Chinn and Chapman saw Sweet as the perfect vehicle for their next wave of chart success. In 1971, the release of Funny Funny changed everything. The song climbed the charts, launching Sweet into non-stop touring, television appearances, and international recognition. Brian Connolly became the face of the band, a striking blonde frontman whose performances on Top of the Pops captured the imagination of a generation. Teenagers adored him, magazines featured him, and fame arrived fast. For a man who grew up feeling unwanted, the adoration was intoxicating. But beneath the surface, a conflict was brewing. The bubblegum pop hits brought success, but they didn't reflect the band's true ambitions. Brian and his bandmates wanted to be taken seriously as rock musicians, not just glam idols. Yet commercial success demanded glitter, costumes, and catchy singles. Brian delivered every performance with professionalism, even as he felt trapped in a role that didn't fully reflect who he was. By 1973, Sweet had become a cultural phenomenon. Songs like Blockbuster, Hellraiser, and Ballroom Blitz dominated charts and airwaves. Brian Connolly was now a global star, projecting confidence, swagger, and effortless charisma. But behind the sequins and smiles, pressure was building. The relentless touring schedule, the expectations to maintain a glam image, and the ongoing struggle for artistic credibility weighed heavily on him. Then, in early 1974, everything changed. After leaving a nightclub in Staines, Brian was attacked by a group of men. The exact circumstances were never fully clarified, but the consequences were devastating. He was kicked repeatedly in the throat, severely damaging his vocal cords. For a time, he could barely speak. Publicly, the incident was dismissed as a throat infection, but the truth was far darker. Brian's voice was his identity, his anchor, his salvation. Losing control of it was catastrophic. When he returned to the studio, he struggled to hit notes that once came naturally. The injury marked a permanent turning point, altering not only his voice, but the course of his life. The aftermath of the assault extended far beyond physical damage. Brian's confidence collapsed. Recording sessions became painful reminders of what he had lost. Bandmates Andy Scott and Steve Priest took on lead vocals to compensate, a practical solution that nevertheless wounded Brian deeply. One of Sweet's greatest opportunities, to open for The Who at Charlton Athletics Stadium, had to be canceled because Brian couldn't perform. The missed chance haunted him. Emotionally, the attack reopened childhood wounds of vulnerability and abandonment. Alcohol became a coping mechanism, not for celebration, but for survival. It quieted his anxiety and dulled the fear that he was no longer good enough. Even as Sweet continued to find success, especially in the United States, Brian was fighting an invisible battle. The assault had taken more than his voice. It had taken his sense of security. From that moment on, fame could no longer protect him, and the cracks began to show. By the late 1970s, Brian's drinking had escalated into a serious problem. On the 1978 U.S. tour, his condition became impossible to ignore. During a show in Birmingham, Alabama, in front of Capitol Records executives, Brian appeared intoxicated, slurred his vocals, and collapsed on stage. The incident was humiliating and marked the beginning of the end. Recording sessions for A Cut Above the Rest were strained and heartbreaking. Mick Tucker tried desperately to help his friend recapture his old strength, but Brian's health was deteriorating. On November 2, 1978, Brian quietly left Sweet. When the announcement became public in 1979, fans were shocked. For Brian, the departure was devastating. Sweet had been his family, his identity, and his anchor. Losing it felt like losing himself. The band moved on, but Brian was left to face a world that no longer knew where to place him. After leaving Sweet, Brian attempted to rebuild his career. He performed in Munich, released solo singles, and continued recording, but the commercial success never returned. His health worsened. Multiple heart attacks left him partially paralyzed, yet he continued to perform with the new Sweet throughout the 1980s. Financial troubles followed, including a crushing tax bill that forced him to sell his home. His marriage ended, leaving him emotionally and financially shattered. Still, Brian refused to give up music. It was the last thread connecting him to who he believed he was. He performed in small venues, holiday camps, anywhere that would have him. The glamour was gone, but the determination remained. In the 1990s, Brian's story reached the public again through the Channel 4 documentary, Don't Leave Me This Way. Viewers saw a frail man, visibly struggling, yet still standing on stage. For the first time, Brian spoke openly about how fame had magnified his insecurities, how the 1974 assault had destroyed his confidence, and how alcohol became a shield he couldn't discard. He admitted that leaving Sweet had broken him emotionally, and that he longed for the unity they once shared. These confessions were raw and deeply human, offering a rare glimpse behind the myth of glam rock. Brian's final performance took place on December 5, 1996, at the Bristol Hippodrome. His health was rapidly failing, but his determination never wavered. In January 1997, he suffered another heart attack and was hospitalized. Though he insisted on returning home, he was readmitted days later. On the night of February 9 into February 10, 1997, Brian Connolly passed away at the age of 51 from kidney and liver failure, compounded by repeated heart attacks. His death marked the end of a life filled with brilliance, struggle, and unresolved pain. Brian's funeral was held on February 17, 1997. His daughters scattered his ashes over water, a quiet farewell to a man who spent his life searching for peace. In the years that followed, fans organized memorial concerts, and plaques were placed in his honor. Brian Connolly left behind family, loved ones, and a musical legacy that continues to inspire artists across generations. His voice, though damaged, remains immortal in the songs that defined an era. Brian Connolly's story is not just a tragedy. It is a deeply human journey through fame, loss, resilience, and longing. Was the biggest turning point the assault that damaged his voice, the pressures of fame, or the unresolved wounds of his childhood? Perhaps it was all of them combined. His life reminds us that behind every legend is a person fighting battles we may never see. If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. Stay with us for more untold stories behind the legends of rock history.